Is the Federal Reserve on the right track with the rate hikes, or is it just going to push us into the next recession? Hey guys, it's Jonathan here. And I read this interesting report from the University of Michigan Survey of Consumers and an article from the Wall Street Journal's Nikkei Leaks that shows us that maybe the Fed has gone too far with their rate hikes. So we'll go through both those reports and talk about them in more details. So let's get into it. So the first report that we have from the University of Michigan Survey of Consumers is titled The 5 Patterns in Consumer Responses to Inflation. And this report's a little dated, it's back from November, but I think it has a lot of good insight for us, especially when it comes to how consumers are responding to inflation. So the University of Michigan did a survey on patterns of how consumers are responding to inflationary pressures. And they created this report called The 5 Patterns in Consumer Responses to Inflation. And even though this report is from November, it does give us some pretty good insights into how the consumer is responding to a lot of the inflation that we've seen over the past year or so. One of the patterns that they saw from all the inflation that we've gotten is that about 60% of consumers have already scaled back their spending in response to inflation. And even more consumers plan on cutting their spending in the years ahead. So it goes on to say that about 51% of respondents to the survey have reported cutting back on their spending. The major categories of these cutbacks are mostly in food and groceries, which makes sense because we have had, I believe it was like 20% inflation in food at home, so that does make sense. We've seen massive pullback in household items, including durables. So when you think about durables, let's think about things that last for over 3 years. So appliances fit into that role, cars fit into that role, things like that. And then thirdly, eating out and entertainment, which also makes sense because we have seen almost the amount of inflation that we've seen at food at home in food and away as well, even though food away was already much higher than food at home. So it does make sense that we see people gravitating more to eating at home and less to eating out. So then the report goes on to talk about how lower income consumers were more likely to adjust their spending than those with higher incomes. And I mean, like, this obviously makes sense. If you have less money and we have inflation, well, then those price increases are going to affect someone with less income more than it's going to affect someone with higher income. So that's kind of common sense. And then hand in hand, it followed up by saying college-educated consumers were more likely to keep their spending unchanged in contrast with those with less education. Again, that makes sense. Your typical college graduate makes more money than your non-college graduate. So makes pretty good sense. Something else that is stated that was really interesting was that consumers between 45 and 64 were considerably more likely to scale back their spending than those younger or older, which makes me think that usually 45 to 64, that's usually when you have kids that are usually on the older end of the spectrum. So maybe finances are a little bit tighter in that section. It might also just be that finances are tight because people are trying to get ready for retirement. Also, this is the age too where you have a lot of college age kids. So I thought that was pretty interesting that they mentioned that. So they continue on by saying that it should be noted that consumers may cut back on spending on goods with large price increases without necessarily reducing total expenditures, consistent with continued growth in retail sales and PCE. Now you have to remember that this survey was taken in the months of August, September, and October. So this was before we saw the rotation away from goods and more to service inflation. Pretty much what that statement is saying is that even though consumers may stop spending money on goods with large price tags, that money can be diverted to be spent on other goods. So that's just something good to keep in mind. It does go on to say that PCE growth has recently slowed down. Again, that's what I was talking about, that move away from goods inflation to service inflation. And then it goes on to say that a large share of consumers are planning to cut back or stop spending in response to high inflation in the year ahead, shows that the slowdown is likely to endure. So when it talks about PCE inflation slowing down, this is a really good sign for markets because that means that this does leave the door open to possibly rapidly slowing inflation. Because think about it, if consumers are more afraid of inflation, then they're less likely to spend. If they're less likely to spend, inflation does come down. And then it goes on to say that about 58% of consumers already have adjusted their spending, and 61% report plans to scale back their spending in the future. So that's a pretty significant response rate that we got when it comes to people starting to slow down their spending, which further embeds that thinking that we will start to see consumers slow down, which could really wrap up the disinflation that we're starting to see in a lot of this inflation reports. Then it goes on to say that also almost half of consumers at the top of the income distribution adjusted their spending, with even a larger share planning cutbacks ahead, showing that cutbacks in spending is not only just focused necessarily on lower income households, but just on all households in general. So again, a very good sign for inflation, especially given the fact that people with higher incomes are more likely to spend their money on discretionary expenses. So the second pattern that they saw in their survey is that consumers who scale back their spending have lower sentiment and higher inflation expectations. So with the University of Michigan, they do a consumer sentiment index. And generally speaking, the higher the number, the more confident consumers are about the economy. And then the lower the number, the less confident they are. So they go on to state that those who reported cutting back or stopped spending on things with large price increases this year averaged 51 on the consumer sentiment index, whereas consumers who did not change their spending patterns held sentiment that was about 20 points higher. It just goes to show you that consumers that did not change their spending habits believe that there's nothing really wrong with the economy, so they're kind of wearing the rose-colored glasses. Whereas people who did adjust their spending do think that, like, yes, this is the time that we need to really hunker down and change some of our spending habits. And then obviously consumers who adjusted their spending habits believe that inflation is going to be much higher in the future. So the third pattern that they're seeing in their surveys is that consumers are more reluctant to borrow for major purchases than to dis-save, which suggests that consumers may pull back spending even more as they draw down their savings. And they go on to say that there's a very low share of consumers that are willing to increase borrowing to make major purchases. And this kind of makes sense because we have such high interest rates, that some of the highest we've seen ever since like right before the Great Recession. So it does make sense that we are seeing consumers be more in this position. And this was kind of the saving grace when we did start to see inflation start to move up, was that, well, at some point people will have to run out of savings, and as the Federal Reserve continues to tighten, we will start to see people kind of slow down their spending, because if they can't borrow money because it's too expensive, but at the same time they've already depleted their savings, then they really have nowhere else to go. So they go on to state that those who are willing to stop saving or to borrow to finance major purchases have higher sentiment and lower short-run inflation expectations, versus those who are unwilling to, that they have lower sentiment and higher long-term inflationary beliefs. And then the fourth pattern that they saw in their survey is that advanced buying motives do not yet appear to be widespread, but are favored by a sizable minority of consumers and remain a risk for the future. And pretty much what advanced buying motives are pretty much, let's say, roll of toilet paper costs you $1 today. Well, if you believe that inflation is going to be 10% next year, then it's like, well, you're going to use toilet paper whether you buy it now or you buy it a year from now. And if you believe that it's going to be more expensive in the future, then you might as well just buy it today and save money. And that's kind of what they're talking about, is that there's good enough minority where people are considering just stocking up on things, which thus drives inflation up even more, because you have the same amount of supply, but then you have more demand, so it increases inflation. And they're just saying that pretty much it could be a risk that this can manifest into something like that, where people start to think, okay, inflation is going to be long term and we're going to stock up on a bunch of things. I'm not really too sure if I agree with that. I think that we are starting to see consumers slow down overall, but it is something that they did find in their report, and it's something that we should keep in mind, especially as supply chains start to go back to normal and we are seeing more supply of items that it may some people may decide to load up on stuff, especially as we see supplies increase. So in the fifth pattern that they saw was that consumers report more awareness of news of inflation, which may influence their attitude. They say that consumers continue to report hearings of unusual levels of negative news about the economy. And for the past 9 months, over a quarter of consumers have specifically mentioned hearing about high prices negatively impacting business conditions in the US. And for consumers that already have a negative perspective of the economy or inflation overall, when they hear news stories about it, it only perpetuates that belief even more and makes it more ingrained into their thinking. And this does make sense given the fact that about 43% of the consumers they surveyed continue to cite high prices as a reason for their the erosion of their standard of living. But then they did go on to say that at the same time, in spite of escalation of negative information about inflation and historically low sentiment reached in June of 2022, long-run inflation expectations have remained in the narrow 2.9 to 3.1% range for 15 of the past 16 months. Taken together, inflation has clearly inflicted much pain over personal finances of consumers, but as of yet, consumers do not expect the extended and repeated periods of inflation experienced in the 1970s. Still, consumers continue to plan spending adjustments for the year ahead. Overall, I think that this is good news for inflation. It is showing that people are starting to adjust their spending. Unfortunately, that is one of the side effects of inflation, is that really the only way you can get inflation down is by reducing people's purchasing power. And the only reason, and by doing that, you also cause their standard of living to erode a bit as well. You know, maybe instead of you buying the steak every week, now you have to buy the ground beef. Maybe instead of you buying the name brand cereal, maybe now you're buying the knockoff cereal. That's some of the things that do play into getting inflation down. But then they also talked about the risk of pull forward demand due to fears of higher inflation in the future. But like they said at the end of the report, that long-run inflation expectations are down and are at a more reasonable number, which usually we want to see inflation somewhere in the 2 to 3% range. That, in my opinion, I don't think that this is much of a concern. Now, you may be saying, okay, this report is all the way from back in November. What about now? Well, let's take a look at that article that we got from the Wall Street Journal, Nick T. So in this article, they talked about how companies have raised prices over the past couple of quarters. Now a lot of companies are either slowing down their price hikes or starting to even reverse the price hikes that they've had in the future. And this is mostly due to them seeing sales volumes fall in the past quarter. And a lot of the deflation that we're seeing, especially in food, kind of like there was a huge deflationary spike in the price of chicken, and it's causing a lot of restaurants to just keep their prices at the same level, but then offer more food to the people that they're selling it to. So that's almost kind of like a way of lowering prices. And pretty much a recurrent theme of this whole report is that a lot of the food industry doesn't really have any pricing power. They're in a position where now, because we're seeing deflation in food, they have to either cut prices or offer more for the same price. And, you know, as a consumer, this is really good. But as an investor, this is what you want to watch out for and avoid, in my opinion. Not necessarily financial advice for you, but I think that these companies are going to really suffer in the future, especially once we do see the Fed pivot and possibly even start cutting rates soon. And there was actually a study by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City where they found that higher markups that a lot of these companies had done, but was actually caused by companies trying to front run inflation and keep their prices high so they don't lag behind with the increased cost to produce their different goods, instead of raising prices just because of outsized demand. And it's not necessarily the same in every industry. So we are starting to see people, when it comes to food expenses, starting to make options of just buying cheaper foods, which obviously makes sense because people have to eat. But when it comes to things like apparel, you're just seeing people just completely opt out of buying stuff or going for a cheaper option as well. We are seeing a movement of way of companies saying, oh, we have all this pricing power and we could just price anything the way we want, to now like, oh, we have to actually be mindful of demand and we have to slow down our rate hikes or maybe even cut prices a little bit. So there is some concern about that. And there was also something really interesting in this report where they talk about how Walmart is working with manufacturers to lower their production costs, in turn to increase Walmart's profits, which may actually make Walmart a pricing power play. Nonetheless, now I'm not too sure about this. It's not personal financial advice, but I do think that this is something interesting to look into. Pretty much what's going on is that it seems like the consumer has kind of reached the boiling point when it comes to inflation. They can't afford more increases to the cost of goods. And I think that this is going to play a major role in bringing inflation down. Because think about it, everything that has to do with inflation is centralized around the consumer. And if the consumer doesn't have the ability to pay higher prices, then guess what's going to happen to prices? They're going to come down, and they have the possibility to come down very quickly. And in turn, inflation come down very quickly. So if the Fed decides to keep going down this path of being extremely aggressive and holding to their above 5% target for the year and then cutting in 2024, they do have a really good chance of overdoing it. But only time will tell to see if they actually do follow through or if they back out once they realize they've gone too far. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, please like and subscribe. And if you think that this video could provide value to someone else, please share it to them. And I'll see you in the next video. Peace.